Have you ever stopped to think about the stories that the Bible holds? Some of them are so remarkable that it's hard to believe. Imagine 7 deaths that defy logic, making you question everything you know. What could lead a person to such an enigmatic end? Could it be divine punishment or a grim warning? These narratives are not just ancient accounts. They hold powerful lessons for us today. When you hear about the death of a king who proclaimed himself a god, or the downfall of someone who challenged the Creator, the mind starts racing. What do these stories have to teach us? Is there a pattern, a connection between them that could change how we view life and death? Get ready to be surprised, because each of these deaths reveals a facet of humanity and the divine. And what if I told you that what you're about to discover could shake your convictions? Stay tuned, because these stories are about to challenge everything you thought you knew about faith and fate. Are you ready for this journey? The Death of Usza. I will never forget the first time I heard the story of Usza. It was an ordinary day, but the narrative hit me in a way I didn't expect. Usza was a guy who, with all the good intentions in the world, tried to protect the Ark of the Covenant, that sacred relic symbolizing God's presence among the people of Israel. Imagine the scene. The Ark was about to fall, and Usza, without thinking twice, reached out to steady it. In an instant, everything changed. His hand was struck down, and he fell dead on the ground. I was shocked. How could something so simple lead to death? This story raises so many questions about holiness. What does it really mean to respect sacred things? Usza was just trying to help, but the gravity of his act shows that sometimes intention is not enough. The Ark was more than just a box. It was a symbol of divine presence. The act of touching it without due reverence was considered a violation of a fundamental principle. It made me think about how, in everyday life, we often act carelessly regarding what is sacred. I wonder how many times, in our quest to do good, we end up disrespecting something that should be treated with reverence. There's a certain fear that comes with this story, a healthy fear, I would say. It's a reminder that there are limits, and that even with good intentions, we must be careful. The story of Usza is a warning about the importance of understanding what we are dealing with, especially when it comes to spiritual matters. Moreover, this narrative touches on something deeper, the relationship between God and man. On one hand, we have the desire to draw closer to God and His things. On the other, there must be a recognition of His greatness and our finitude. Usza's death was not just an individual tragedy. It was an act of God that demanded a renewed respect for holiness. This tension between proximity and reverence is something we often feel but cannot articulate. Ultimately, this story makes me reflect on how often we put ourselves in situations where we act impulsively without thinking of the consequences. Usza's death teaches us that spiritual life requires caution and respect. It's a call for us to be more aware of our actions and the impact they have on our relationship with the sacred. The death of Ananias and Sapphira. When the story of Ananias and Sapphira comes up, I can't help but feel a sense of discomfort. Here, we have a couple who, instead of being honest about the sale of a property, chose to lie and deceive the community. What I find most impactful is that they were not just lying to the apostles, but to God. This idea that dishonesty can have such severe consequences makes me think about the seriousness with which we handle the truth in our own lives. The narrative unfolds in a way that leads us to question, why did Ananias and Sapphira feel the need to lie? They were part of a community that shared everything, and apparently the pressure to fit in and be accepted was so great that they preferred to act dishonestly. The gravity of the situation makes me think about how dishonesty, even in small things, can have far greater repercussions than we imagine. The story is a warning, a reminder that we cannot play with the truth, especially when it comes to spiritual and communal matters. Furthermore, this narrative also highlights the importance of integrity within the community. The example of Ananias and Sapphira shows us that hypocrisy can undermine the foundations of any group. It's a call to action for us to be more transparent and honest with one another, for authenticity is essential for a healthy relationship, whether in the Christian community or elsewhere. Finally, the death of Ananias and Sapphira makes me reflect on what it truly means to be part of a community. It's an invitation for us to examine our motivations and actions, ensuring that our practices align with our values. The truth, though sometimes uncomfortable, is always the best choice. The death of Herod Agrippa. The story of Herod Agrippa's death is one that impacts me the most, not just because of how it happened, but what it represents. Here we have a man who let himself be carried away by pride and vanity. He accepted the praises of the people as if he were a god, and that is something I cannot imagine. It's as if fame and power blinded him to his true condition. What intrigues me is how he did not see the abyss he was putting himself into. When I heard that Herod was eaten by worms, something inside me froze. It's a horrific death and in a way poetic. The divine punishment was as drastic as his arrogance. This scene makes me think about the dangers of pride. Often, we're so caught up in our lives and achievements that we forget where we came from. Herod's story is a brutal reminder that pride can lead us to a tragic end. I wonder if, at any moment, Herod had the chance to repent. He seemed so self-assured, so wrapped up in his own image. This makes me reflect on how many times we also fall into the trap of self-sufficiency. It's easy to get carried away by others' approval and forget that ultimately we are all vulnerable. Herod's death is a warning about the dangers of placing our identity in the hands of others. In addition, this narrative also teaches us about the importance of humility. While Herod sought to be exalted, the true path is one of servitude and simplicity. It is a call for us to look at our own lives and question what we truly value. Are we seeking applause, or are we seeking to serve? The death of Herod challenges us to reevaluate our motivations and recognize that true greatness does not come from human recognition, but from character and integrity. Ultimately, the death of Herod Agrippa reminds us that arrogance comes at a price. It is an invitation to reflect on how we handle power and fame in our lives. May we learn from his mistake and seek true humility, recognizing that, ultimately, we are all equal before God. The death of Jezebel. The story of Jezebel evokes vivid images and intense emotions. From her introduction, she is portrayed as a manipulative and idolatrous figure who did not hesitate to eliminate God's prophets to promote her own gods. The brutal way she died, being thrown from a window and trampled by horses, is a testament to divine justice manifesting in unexpected ways. I cannot help but feel a certain indignation when imagining the scene, but also a sense that justice has been served. Jezebel represents everything that is opposite to devotion and respect for true worship. She personifies moral corruption and idolatry, and her death symbolizes the punishment that comes upon those who oppose God. The story reminds us that even when it seems that injustice and evil prevail, there's a moral law that cannot be ignored. Jezebel's fate confirms that justice, though it may take time, eventually arrives. I wonder how Jezebel felt in the final moments of her life. Did she realize the gravity of her actions? It is interesting to think that in her quest for power and control, she became a victim of her own wickedness. This makes me reflect on how often we are blind to the consequences of our choices. Her story is a warning about the dangers of straying from what is right in the name of selfish interests. Furthermore, the death of Jezebel also leads us to consider the issue of responsibility. In a world where corruption and dishonesty often seem to be rewarded, her story reminds us that we are all accountable for our actions. No one can escape the consequences of their choices, and justice, even if it seems distant, always finds a way to manifest. It is an invitation to examine our own actions and strive to live with integrity. Finally, the narrative of Jezebel's death makes me reflect on the importance of remaining true to the principles and values we hold sacred. Her story is a reminder that idolatry in its various forms can lead us away from what truly matters. May we learn from her era and the Strangest, the death of Jezebel. When I think of Jezebel, I cannot help but imagine a formidable and feared figure surrounded by intrigue and manipulation. She was not just a queen, she was a force of nature, a woman who defied the norms of her time. But, like any story that involves power, hers had a dramatic and violent end. The narrative of her death is a clear example of divine justice, a warning for all who venture down the path of idolatry and moral corruption. The manner in which she was eliminated is almost poetic in its brutality. Thrown from a window, her body found no rest. It was trampled by horses, a scene that remains etched in the memory of those who know it. What shocks me most about this story is how Jezebel let herself be driven by her unchecked ambition. She did not only worship idols, but also promoted this worship among the people, diverting them from true faith. The idolatry she introduced was not just a religious issue, it was a matter of morality, a deviation that led many away from God. When I think about the effects of her actions, I can only imagine how many lives were affected by her decisions. Every sacrifice made to Baal, every cult promoted in her lands, was not merely a matter of worship, but of corruption of values. Jezebel's death was not only a consequence of her betrayal of God, it was also a reflection of her life. She lived surrounded by luxury and power, but in the end, all of that turned to nothing. The disdain her body received after her death is a strong symbol. The fact that her remains were devoured by dogs, leaving only her palms and skull, is an image that makes me reflect on the futility of seeking power at any cost. The message is clear. When one trifles with the sacred, divine justice does not delay in arriving. And if we stop to think, Jezebel's story is a warning about what happens when ambition and personal desires are prioritized over morality and ethics. What can we learn from her life and death? That the pursuit of power can lead to a tragic end, and that the consequences of our actions often do not appear immediately. Divine justice may seem delayed, but it is inevitable. And it is this reflection that makes Jezebel's story so powerful and relevant even today. In essence, Jezebel's death is not just about her fall, but about what she represents, a woman who, in her quest for control and influence, forgot to respect divine order. It is a reminder that life can seem grand at one moment, and in the next be reduced to a grim warning for those who walk the same path. In reflecting on Jezebel, we are challenged to examine our own lives and the choices we make. How far are we willing to go for power? And what price are we willing to pay? The death of Usza. The sons of Eli are undoubtedly one of the saddest and most impactful stories I know. They were not just priests, they were those who were supposed to guide the people towards God. But instead, they used their position for personal gain, dishonoring the temple and abusing their power. Their death in battle, as a result of divine judgment, is a brutal reminder of the gravity of the spiritual responsibility we carry. Their lives serve as a warning for all of us about the consequences of neglecting our duty. When I think of Eli, I imagine a man who, despite his flaws, still had an important role in the lives of the people. He saw his sons stray from the path, and in many ways, his inaction was as culpable as their actions. This leads me to reflect on the responsibility we have in our own lives. How many times do we see something wrong and choose to ignore it? The story of Eli and his sons forces us to confront the reality that by not acting, we are also complicit. The death of Eli's sons is a grim reminder that God's justice is not just a matter of punishment, but also of responsibility. What really impresses me is the way the narrative shows us that Eli's sons were not only dishonoring the temple, they were dishonoring God. The relationship we have with spirituality and religion is sacred, and when that relationship is corrupted, the consequences can be devastating. Their death in battle was not an isolated event, but a direct repercussion of their actions. They not only failed to honor God, but also betrayed the trust of the people who depended on them. This is something that should make us think about how we treat our responsibilities, whether they are spiritual or not. Eli, upon receiving the news of his sons' deaths, not only lost his sons, but also witnessed the downfall of an entire priestly lineage. The pain he must have felt must have been profound, a mix of sadness, guilt, and despair. This makes me think about the impact our actions have, not just on ourselves, but on the people around us. The legacy we leave is shaped not just by our victories, but also by our failures. And often, failures come at a cost that goes beyond our understanding. The death of Eli's sons teaches us that spiritual responsibility is one of the most serious burdens we can carry. We must be aware of our actions and how they affect not only our lives, but the life of the community around us. Reflecting on this story, I'm reminded that we all have a role to play, and that inaction can be as harmful as wrong action. It is a call for us to be vigilant and responsible in everything we do, especially with regard to what is sacred. The death of Judas Iscariot. The story of Judas Iscariot is one of the most tragic of all. One of the 12 apostles, Judas had the honor of being close to Jesus, hearing his teachings, and even witnessing miracles. However, he made a choice that would lead him to a dark fate. Judas' betrayal, handing Jesus over for 30 pieces of silver, is not just an act of treachery, it is a reflection on human nature, on how the choices we make can have devastating consequences. His death, after an act of despair, raises profound questions about regret and guilt. When I think of Judas, I can't help but feel a mix of pity and reproach. He made a conscious choice that altered the course of history, but what led him to this betrayal? Was it greed, disillusionment, or perhaps a deep sense of inadequacy? Judas is a character that evokes empathy in many, for ultimately, he was also human. The pain he must have felt after realizing the gravity of his action resonates deeply. Judas' suicide is an extreme expression of despair and regret, an attempt to escape a guilt that consumed him. Judas' regret is a theme we cannot ignore. Upon realizing he had betrayed the Son of God, he was filled with remorse. His attempt to return the silver coins is a gesture that speaks louder than words. He could not bear the weight of his choice, and this makes me ponder how we deal with our own failures. Often, the choices we make can lead us to a point of no return, and regret can be a bitter companion. Judas teaches us that no matter how much we want to correct our mistakes, some actions have irreversible consequences. Judas' death also makes us reflect on the concept of guilt and what we do with it. He isolated himself, unable to find forgiveness even for himself. His story is a warning about what happens when we allow ourselves to be consumed by our failures and wrong choices. The path of repentance must be walked, but for Judas, that path became a dead end. This leads us to question, how do we deal with our failures? Are we willing to seek forgiveness, or do we let ourselves be carried away by guilt and despair? Judas Iscariot's betrayal is a grim reminder that we all have the potential to choose paths that take us away from what is right. He is a reflection of the internal struggle between light and darkness that exists within each of us. His story should serve as a warning. The choices we make have consequences, and regret may come too late. Thus, as we reflect on Judas, we are challenged to consider our own choices and the importance of remaining true to what is right, even in the face of temptation. Final reflections. The death of Jezebel, the death of Eli's sons, and that of Judas Iscariot are stories that go beyond the tragic events themselves. They speak to us about human nature, the choices we make, and the consequences that come with those choices. Each of these narratives carries valuable lessons about responsibility, regret, and the importance of respect. The death of the 42 youths by bear. Look, this story of the 42 youths who were attacked by a bear is one of those that makes you stop and think. You know, the Bible isn't afraid to lay out the consequences of our actions, and this episode is a clear example of that. Imagine the scene. A group of youths, full of energy and disrespect, dares to mock a man who is a messenger of God. This is not just a misunderstanding, but a lack of reverence that resonates across various cultures and eras. What they did not know is that their words and actions could have repercussions far more serious than a mere insult. The prophet Elisha was passing through the city, and those youths called him Baldy, an insult that even today could be considered a tasteless joke. But what follows is simply terrifying. From a place of contempt and mockery, they attracted divine wrath. It is curious how, throughout history, disrespect for sacred things or for God's messengers has always come at a price. The message here is clear. Respecting those who represent the voice of God is essential. And if you think this is just an old story, consider how many times today we see people discrediting or mocking beliefs and religious figures. When the bear came out of the forest, it was not a random attack. It was there as an instrument of divine justice, and the outcome was devastating. 42 youths losing their lives in an instant for something that started with words and laughter. This makes me reflect on the gravity of the words we use and how they can have consequences that go far beyond what we imagine. Sometimes we laugh at something that, in a larger context, can end up generating a domino effect that hits us back in ways we did not foresee. It is interesting to note that in this episode, the bear did not just attack, but fulfilled a purpose. The respect for divine messages and messengers is a recurring theme in the Bible, and when ignored, it brings severe consequences. This narrative serves as a reminder that even in modern times, contempt for sacred things can lead to personal and collective disasters. As a society, we should ask ourselves, where is our reverence? Are we in some way mocking the messengers of God in our lives? Ultimately, the story of the 42 youths is a warning and an invitation to reflection. If we do not respect the voices that call us to higher purposes, that remind us of the importance of spirituality, we may end up facing consequences that will leave us perplexed. After all, what is mockery one day can turn into tragedy the next, and this applies to each of our lives. Chapter 1. The Death of Saul. The death of Saul is a tragic narrative that makes us reflect on what happens when pride and disobedience become part of our identity. Here is a man who began his journey with promises and hopes, but along the way, he strayed from what truly mattered. I remember how, in many moments of life, we allow ourselves to be carried away by desires and ambitions that distance us from our values. Saul, the first king of Israel, had his fate sealed by choices that led him to a dead end. Saul faced a battle that, at first, seemed to be yet another of his victories. However, God's rejection weighed on him like a shadow. The story reveals to us that when we begin to stray from a greater purpose, the fall is inevitable. The pressure to lead, the need to prove his worth, and the insecurities fueled by fear led him to make wrong decisions. He sought the counsel of a medium instead of turning to God, which shows how hopelessness can lead us to actions that, at first glance, seem small but have a profound impact. The final scene of his life is marked by despair. In a moment of desperation, he chose to end his own life, preferring death to being captured by his enemies. This makes us think, how far are we willing to go to avoid shame or defeat? Suicide is a delicate issue, and even though Saul's narrative is ancient, the emotions it evokes are timeless. The internal struggle he faced is something many of us know, even if we do not reach that extreme. Saul's downfall is a powerful reminder that arrogance and disobedience can lead us to dark places. We should not ignore the signs that we are straying from the path. Looking at his trajectory, I am led to question what areas of my life I might be drifting away from the principles I stand for. Saul found himself in a downward spiral, and this spiral began with small acts of disobedience that became great chasms. Ultimately, Saul's death is not just a story about a king, but a warning for all of us. Our choices matter, and pride can blind us to the consequences of our actions. Saul's story echoes through the ages, serving as a reminder that we must remain humble and always willing to listen to God's voice, even when it means confronting our failures and limitations. Life is a journey of choices, and most of the time, we are the ones who decide what our destiny will be. So, folks, after everything we've seen so far, it's impossible not to reflect on the depth of the stories the Bible presents to us.